Billionaire resents women until he sees a black caregiver make his dying father laugh, then watches him give her his late wife's pearl. Daniel Whitmore had spent 30 years building walls against women, but watching her dreadlocks catch the hospital light as she guided his dying father into laughter, then witnessing his father press his late wife's pearl into her gentle hands, those walls didn't just crack, they crumbled entirely. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The elevator climbed toward the penthouse floor of Manhattan Presbyterian's private wing, each passing number a reminder of how money could buy the best medical care but couldn't purchase what mattered most. Daniel Whitmore adjusted his Italian silk tie and checked his Patek Philippe watch, 4:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes since his assistant had called with the update about his father's condition. What do you think shapes someone's deepest prejudices, their experiences, or their fears? Share your thoughts below. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway that smelled of expensive disinfectant and fresh flowers, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in Daniel's chest. At 38, he'd built an empire worth $12 billion, but standing here, he felt as powerless as the day his mother had walked out when he was 7 years old. "Mr. Whitmore?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see a young woman in scrubs approaching, her dreadlocks pulled back in a neat bun that somehow managed to look both professional and effortlessly beautiful. Her warm brown eyes met his with a professionalism that didn't feel cold. "I'm Amelia Johnson, your father's primary caregiver. Dr. Martinez wanted me to brief you on his condition." Daniel's jaw tightened automatically. Another woman trying to manage his life, his father's life, their family's business. The dreadlocks especially irritated him. Too casual, too personal for a medical environment. He'd learned early that women left when things got difficult, and he'd spent 30 years making sure they never got close enough to disappoint him again. "I'll speak with Dr. Martinez directly," he said, his voice carrying the authority that made Fortune 500 CEOs scramble. "I don't need a nurse's interpretation of my father's medical situation." Amelia didn't flinch. If anything, her expression softened with something that looked suspiciously like understanding. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Dr. Martinez is in surgery, but he'll be available around 7. Your father is awake now, though, and asking for you." The way she said it, gentle but direct, caught him off guard. Most people either cowered before his wealth and power or challenged it with their own agenda. This woman seemed to exist in some middle space he didn't recognize. "Room 1247, she added, then paused. "He's having a good day today. Clear, alert, telling stories about your mother. Those are precious now." The mention of his mother sent a familiar spike of pain through his chest. Daniel wanted to dismiss her words, to reduce them to professional platitudes, but something in her tone suggested she understood exactly what precious meant when time was running out. He found his father, Thomas Whitmore, propped up in a bed that probably cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by monitors that beeped with mechanical precision. At 72, Thomas had been a titan of industry, a man who had taught Daniel that weakness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Now, cancer had reduced him to a shadow, wrapped in expensive cotton pajamas. But what struck Daniel most was the small wooden box on the bedside table, one he recognized from his childhood. The box that had held his mother's most precious jewelry, including the pearl that his father had given her on their wedding day. "Danny," Thomas's voice was barely above a whisper, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had built their family's fortune. "You look like hell." "Thanks, Dad. You look fantastic yourself." Daniel pulled up a chair, his eyes still drawn to the jewelry box. "What's that doing here?" Thomas followed his gaze and smiled. "Amelia asked me about the pictures on my nightstand. Started telling her about your mother, about how we met.
brought this up from home yesterday. Sometimes it helps to have something real to hold on to. Daniel. She's got me talking about things I haven't spoken about in years. About the pearl, about how nervous I was giving it to my mother, about how she cried when I told her I'd found it myself during our honeymoon dive in Tahiti. His eyes grew distant. Amelia said it sounded like a fairy tale. Made me remember it was. She's doing her job, Dad. No, son. She's doing something else entirely. She listens to my stories about my mother without trying to change the subject or make me feel better. She just listens. When did you become so cynical about people's motives? Daniel knew the answer to that question, but he'd never said it aloud. The day Mom packed her bags and told 7-year-old Daniel that some people weren't meant to be mothers. The day he'd stood at the window watching her taxi disappear, realizing that the woman who had given him life had chosen to exit it without looking back. I learned from experience, he said. Thomas studied his son's face with the intensity that had made him legendary in boardrooms. Your mother leaving wasn't about you, Danny. It was about her own pain, her own inability to cope with my work schedule, with the pressure of our life. But you've turned that wound into a weapon against half the human race. It's kept me focused, successful. Has it kept you happy? The question hung in the air like smoke. Daniel had never equated success with happiness. Happiness seemed like a luxury for people who didn't understand how quickly everything could disappear. But sitting here, watching his father's labored breathing, he wondered if he'd confused protection with isolation. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Amelia came in carrying a small vase with fresh flowers, not the elaborate arrangements that filled the room, but simple daisies that looked like they'd been picked from a roadside meadow. Her dreadlocks caught the afternoon light streaming through the window, and Daniel found himself momentarily distracted by how they framed her face. I thought these might brighten things up. My grandmother always said hospital flowers were too fancy to be cheerful. Thomas's face lit up. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Raised me after my parents died when I was 12. Used to say that the best medicine was a combination of prayer, laughter, and knowing someone cared enough to bring you wildflowers instead of roses. Amelia's voice carried a warmth that seemed to fill the sterile room.
Daniel watched this exchange with growing irritation. His father was dying, and this woman was talking about flowers and grandmothers as if they were having tea instead of confronting mortality. The easy intimacy between them felt like emotional manipulation, designed to make them both vulnerable to whatever agenda she was working. "How much is the hospital paying you?" Daniel asked abruptly. Amelia turned to look at him, and for the first time, he saw surprise in her eyes. "I'm sorry?" "For the extra attention, the personal touches, the flowers and the heart-to-heart conversations about family heirlooms. Is this some kind of premium care package we're being charged for?" The room fell silent except for the steady beep of monitors. Thomas's face flushed with anger, but before he could speak, Amelia held up a gentle hand. "The flowers are from my own garden," she said quietly. "I bring them because your father mentioned that he missed seeing growing things. The conversations happen because he's an interesting man with stories worth hearing. And the laughter?" She glanced at Thomas with genuine fondness. "That's just what happens when you listen to someone's life instead of just monitoring their vital signs." Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not quite shame, but close to it. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did!" Amelia's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the softness. "You meant exactly what you said. You've decided that any kindness must have a price tag, that any attention must be calculated. That's your choice, Mr. Whitmore, but it's not my reality." She turned back to Thomas, who was watching this exchange with fascination. "I'll be back in an hour to check on your medication. Try to rest." As she moved toward the door, Thomas called out, "Amelia, thank you for everything." She paused, her hand on the doorframe, and Daniel caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in her expression. "Thank you for trusting me with your stories, Mr. Whitmore. Not everyone gets to hear about finding a pearl in the middle of the ocean and knowing it was meant for the love of their life." After she left, father and son sat in silence for many minutes. Thomas's hand moved to rest on the jewelry box, his fingers tracing its familiar edges. "That woman has been here for 3 days," Thomas said finally. "In that time, she's learned more about my life, about your mother, about what really matters than most people who've known me for years. She listens, Danny, really listens. And she sees beauty in things, in stories, in memories, in moments that others might dismiss as an old man's rambling." Daniel didn't answer, but as he sat in the expensive chair beside his father's expensive bed, surrounded by expensive medical equipment that couldn't cure what was killing the man who taught him everything about success, he wondered if he'd spent so much time building walls that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be human. And despite every instinct screaming at him to maintain his defenses, he couldn't stop thinking about the way Amelia's dreadlocks had caught the light, or how her voice had softened when she spoke about her grandmother, or how his father's entire demeanor had changed in her presence. For the first time in 30 years, Daniel Whitmore wondered if he'd been wrong about everything. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray October light that made even Manhattan's skyline look muted. Daniel had spent the night in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling and replaying yesterday's conversation with his father. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amelia's face, the way she had looked when he had accused her of having an agenda, the quiet dignity in her response, the genuine warmth in her voice when she had spoken about his mother's pearl. He'd built his fortune on reading people, on identifying their weaknesses and motivations. But Amelia Johnson didn't fit into any category he understood, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Daniel arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, armed with coffee and the Wall Street Journal, prepared to maintain his normal routine of checking on his father's medical progress and handling any business calls that couldn't wait. What he wasn't prepared for was the sound of laughter, rich, genuine laughter coming from room 1247. He paused outside the door, his hand frozen on the handle. Through the small window, he could see his father propped up in bed, more animated than he had appeared in weeks. Amelia sat beside him, her dreadlocks loose around her shoulders today, no longer pulled back in the professional bun. She was holding what looked like a small photo, and both she and Thomas were laughing at whatever story it had prompted. "So there I was," Thomas was saying, his voice stronger than Daniel had heard it in months. 25 years old, standing on this rickety boat in the middle of the Pacific, convinced I was going to drown before I could propose to the woman I loved. The captain, this ancient Hawaiian man named Koa, he looks at me and says, "Boy, the ocean doesn't give up its treasures to cowards." Amelia's laughter was like music, not the polite, professional cuckle Daniel had expected, but something spontaneous and joyful. "So you actually dove down to find the pearl yourself? 23 feet down and waters so blue it looked like liquid sapphire. I'd never freedived that deep before, but I was young and stupid and desperate to prove I was worthy of Margaret." Thomas's eyes grew distant with memory. "I saw it there, sitting in this outcropping of coral like it was waiting for me. Most perfect pearl I ever seen. Not too big, not too small, with this luminous quality that seemed to glow even underwater." Daniel felt something clench in his chest. He'd heard fragments of this story before, but never like this. Never with such vivid detail, such obvious joy in the telling. His father hadn't spoken about his mother with anything but sadness for 15 years. "And when you gave it to her?" Amelia prompted,
leaning forward slightly. Thomas's smile was radiant. She cried, not because it was expensive, though it probably was worth more than my car at the time, but because I told her the story. She said knowing I'd literally dove to the bottom of the ocean to find something beautiful enough for her was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done. She was right, Amelia said softly. That's not just a proposal, that's a declaration of how far you were willing to go for love. Daniel watched his father's face transform, years of grief and regret melting away as he relived that moment. When had he last seen his father look genuinely happy? When had he last heard him speak about love without bitterness? She wore it every day, not as a necklace. She was too practical for that. She had it set in a simple ring, said she wanted to feel it against her skin, wanted to remember that love was worth diving for. His voice caught slightly. I haven't looked at it since the funeral. Too painful. But today, telling you about it, it felt different. Like maybe it was time to let it see the light again.
Daniel stepped into the room, and both Thomas and Amelia turned toward him. His father's face lit up with a smile that made him look 10 years younger. Danny, perfect timing. I was just telling Amelia about the pearl. I heard, Daniel said, setting down his coffee and taking his usual chair. Up close, he could see that Amelia's eyes were slightly bright with unshed tears. Dad, you seem better today. I feel better. Sometimes talking about the good times makes you remember that life hasn't been all struggle. Thomas glanced at Amelia with obvious affection. This one has a gift for making people remember what matters. Have you ever witnessed a moment that completely changed how you saw someone? What was it about that moment that shifted your perspective? Share your experience below. Amelia stood, smoothing her scrubs. I should let you two have some family time. I'll check back later with your medication. Actually, Thomas said, his voice taking on a note Daniel recognized, the same tone he'd used in boardrooms when he was about to make a decision that would surprise everyone. Amelia, would you mind staying for a few minutes? There's something I want to show you. Daniel felt a prickle of unease. His father's hand was moving toward the jewelry box on the bedside table, and there was something in his expression, a combination of peace and determination that made Daniel's stomach tighten. Dad, Daniel said quietly, maybe we should discuss— No discussion needed, Thomas interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. I've been thinking about this all night, and I know exactly what I want to do. He opened the jewelry box with hands that trembled slightly but moved with purpose. The pearl ring sat nestled in faded velvet, catching the morning light with that same luminous quality he'd described. Even from across the room, he could see why his father had been willing to risk his life for it. Amelia, Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, I want you to have this. The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of monitors. Daniel felt the world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His father was holding out the ring, his mother's ring, the symbol of his parents' love story, to a woman they'd known for 4 days. Mr. Whitmore, Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible, I can't accept that. It's too precious, too personal. It belongs to your family. It belongs to someone who understands its value. Not its monetary value, any appraiser could tell you that, but its real value. You understand that it represents a man willing to risk everything for love. You understand that it's not just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of how far someone will go for the people they care about. Daniel watched in stunned silence as his father's words hung in the air. This wasn't happening. His father couldn't be giving away his mother's ring to a stranger, no matter how kind she'd been. Your mother would have liked you, Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. She would have recognized a kindred spirit,
Someone who sees beauty in simple things, who listens to stories without trying to fix them, who brings wildflowers instead of roses. He paused, his eyes glistening. She would have wanted this to go to someone who understands that love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up day after day and choosing to see the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves. Daniel felt something crack inside his chest. His father wasn't just giving away a ring. He was passing on a legacy, a belief system, a way of seeing the world that Daniel had rejected years ago. "I've been carrying this for 15 years, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, carrying it like a burden instead of a blessing. But watching you these past few days, seeing how you've brought joy back into this room, made me remember what Margaret and I had. You've given me back my good memories, Amelia. You've helped me remember that love is something to celebrate, not something to grieve." Amelia's tears were flowing freely now, and she made no attempt to hide them. "But your son—" "My son will understand," Thomas said, glancing at Daniel with a mixture of hope and challenge in his eyes, "because he's about to learn something I should have taught him years ago. Love isn't diminished by sharing it. It's multiplied." Daniel felt every defense he'd built over 30 years crumbling at once. He watched his father place the ring in Amelia's trembling hands, watched her close her fingers around it as if it were the most precious thing she'd ever held. The reverence in her touch, the way she looked at the ring as if she understood its entire history, the tears streaming down her face, it was the most authentic reaction he'd ever witnessed. "I don't know what to say," Amelia whispered. "Say you'll remember the story," Thomas replied. "Say you'll remember that someone once loved my wife enough to dive to the bottom of the ocean for her. And maybe, if you're very lucky, someone will love you that much too." The silence that followed was profound. Daniel stared at Amelia, really looked at her for the first time since they'd met. The way she held the ring, the way she looked at his father with such genuine affection, the way she'd brought light into this sterile room, it wasn't calculation or manipulation. It was simply who she was. And in that moment, watching his dying father give away his most precious possession to a woman who'd shown him kindness, Daniel felt something he'd spent 30 years trying to avoid, the terrifying, overwhelming, undeniable recognition of falling in love. "Thank you," Amelia finally managed, her voice thick with tears. "I'll treasure it always, not just the ring, but the story, the love it represents, the trust you've shown me." Thomas smiled, looking more at peace than Daniel had seen him since the diagnosis. "You've already given me more than I could ever repay. You've given me back my joy." Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need some air," he said, his voice rough. He walked quickly toward the door but paused when he heard his father's voice. "Danny?" Daniel turned and saw his father looking at him with an expression of infinite love and understanding. "She's not your mother. She's not going to leave when things get difficult. Some people are built to run from love, and some people are built to run toward it. You've spent so long protecting yourself from the first kind that you've forgotten how to recognize the second." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and left the room. But as he walked down the hospital corridor, he couldn't shake the image of Amelia's face when she'd received the ring, or the way his father had looked at her with such profound gratitude. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel Whitmore wondered if he'd been wrong about everything that mattered.
Daniel spent the next 3 hours walking the streets of Manhattan, trying to process what he'd witnessed. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of hot dogs and exhaust fumes, but all he could smell was the faint lavender scent that had lingered in his father's room. Amelia's perfume, he realized, though he'd never consciously noticed it before. He found himself standing outside Central Park,
watching families push strollers and couples walk hand in hand, and for the first time in years, he felt the acute loneliness of his carefully constructed life. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, reminders about board meetings and merger negotiations. But the corporate world that had once felt like his natural habitat now seemed hollow and artificial. When he finally returned to the hospital, evening was settling over the city. The hallways were quieter, filled with the soft sounds of dinner carts and visiting families saying their goodbyes. Daniel paused outside his father's room, steeling himself for whatever conversation awaited him. Inside, Thomas was sleeping peacefully, the jewelry box now empty beside his bed. Amelia sat in the chair Daniel usually occupied, reading quietly by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. She'd changed into street clothes, a simple burgundy sweater and dark jeans that made her look younger, more approachable. The pearl ring was on her right hand, and she kept touching it absently as she read, as if making sure it was real. "How is he?" Daniel asked softly, settling into the chair across from her. Amelia looked up, and Daniel was struck by how tired she appeared. Peaceful. The excitement from this morning wore him out, but in a good way. He's been sleeping since about 4. He marked her place in the book, something about gardening, he noticed. He was worried about you. Said you looked like you'd seen a ghost. He studied her face, searching for any sign of the calculated manipulation he'd spent years learning to detect. Instead, he saw genuine concern, the kind of empathy that couldn't be faked. "Maybe I did." "The ghost of your mother." The question was so direct, so understanding, that Daniel felt his carefully maintained composure wobble. "Among others." Amelia closed her book and set it aside, giving him her full attention. "Want to talk about it?" "I don't talk about personal things." The words came out automatically, a reflex developed over decades of keeping people at arm's length. "I know." Her voice was gentle, without judgment. "But sometimes not talking about things gives them more power than they deserve." Daniel found himself staring at her hands, the way she wore his father's ring as if it belonged there. "Why did you accept it?" "The ring?" Amelia glanced down at her hand, her expression thoughtful. "Because saying no would have hurt him more than keeping it will hurt me." "What do you mean, hurt you?" For the first time since she met him, Amelia looked vulnerable. "Do you know what it's like to receive something so precious from someone you're going to lose? To have a dying man trust you with his most sacred memory?" She touched the ring again, her voice barely higher than a whisper. "I'll carry the weight of that gift for the rest of my life, the responsibility of living up to what it represents." Daniel felt something shift in his chest. He'd assumed she'd accepted the ring because of its value, because of what it might mean for her financially. He'd never considered that receiving it might be a burden as much as a blessing. "You could have refused," he said quietly. "Could I?" Amelia's eyes met his, and he saw a complexity there he'd been too prejudiced to notice before. "Your father is dying, Mr. Whitmore. He has so few opportunities left to make meaningful gestures, to feel like he's passing something important to someone who will cherish it. Taking that away from him would have been cruel. So you sacrificed your own comfort for his peace of mind." "I did what anyone with a heart would do." She paused, then added more softly, "What you would have done if you'd let yourself." The observation hit him like a physical blow. "You don't know me." "I know you've been here every day since he was admitted. I know you've made sure he has the best care money can buy. I know you rearranged a board meeting yesterday so you could be here when he woke up from his afternoon nap." Amelia's voice carried a conviction that made Daniel's defenses feel suddenly fragile. "I'm not afraid." "You're terrified." The words were spoken gently, but with absolute certainty. "You're terrified of caring too much, of letting someone matter enough to hurt you. You're terrified of ending up like your father, loving someone so completely that losing them nearly destroys you." Daniel felt exposed, as if he'd reached inside his chest and pulled out his deepest fears. "You think you have me figured out? I think you've spent so long protecting yourself from pain that you've forgotten how to recognize joy." Amelia leaned forward slightly, and Daniel caught that lavender scent again. "I think you saw your father's face when he gave me that ring, and it scared you because it reminded you what love actually looks like." When was the last time someone saw through your defenses and called you on your fears? How did it feel to be truly seen? Share your thoughts below. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady beep of Thomas's monitors. Daniel wanted to deny her words, to retreat behind his familiar walls of cynicism and control. But sitting here in the soft lamplight, watching her unconsciously touch the ring his father had given her, he couldn't summon his usual defenses. He loved her so much it nearly killed him when she died. For 2 years after the funeral, he barely spoke, barely ate. I had to run the company because he couldn't function. I was 23 years old, and I had to watch my father disappear into grief so complete I thought I'd lose him too. Amelia's expression softened. "Is that when you decided love was too dangerous?" "That's when I decided love was a luxury I couldn't afford. I watched what it did to him. I watched him fall apart, and I swore I'd never let myself be that vulnerable to another person. And yet here you are, sitting beside his bed every day, letting him matter enough to hurt you." Daniel looked at his sleeping father, at the peace in his weathered face. "That's different. He's family." "Love is love," Amelia said simply. "Whether it's family or friendship or romance, it requires the same leap of faith, the same willingness to risk everything for something that might not last." "But might be worth it anyway," Daniel said, surprised by his own words. "But might be worth it anyway," she agreed.
They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both watching Thomas sleep. Daniel found himself studying Amelia's profile, the way the lamplight played across her features, the gentle way she adjusted his father's blanket when he stirred. Everything about her radiated warmth and competence, but there was something else, a strength that didn't need to announce itself, a grace that came from accepting life's difficulties without becoming bitter. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said eventually. "Of course. Why do you do this? Take care of people who are dying, I mean. It must be heartbreaking." Amelia was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently turning the ring. "Because someone has to witness their stories. Someone has to make sure they're not forgotten." She looked at him directly. "Your father has lived an extraordinary life. He's loved deeply, built something lasting, raised a son who's more like him than either of you realize. Those stories deserve to be heard. That love deserves to be celebrated. Even knowing it will end? Especially knowing it will end." Her voice carried a conviction that made Daniel's chest tight. The temporary nature of something doesn't make it less precious. It makes it more so. Daniel felt something fundamental shifting inside him, like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, this job would destroy me." "Has it ever destroyed you, I mean?" Amelia's smile was sad but genuine. "A few times, but then I meet someone like your father, someone who reminds me why it's worth it, someone who shows me that love isn't just about the ending, it's about everything that comes before." Thomas stirred in his sleep, making a small sound that had both of them instantly alert, but he settled back into peaceful breathing, and they relaxed. "He's going to die soon," Daniel said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Amelia replied, matching his tone. "Probably within the week." The words hung in the air between them, carrying a weight that felt almost physical. Daniel had known this intellectually, had been prepared for it medically and financially, but hearing it spoken aloud, in this intimate setting, made it real in a way that threatened to shatter his composure. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Do what?" "Say goodbye. Let him go. Be alone again." Amelia reached across the space between their chairs and covered his hand with hers. The contact was electric, sending warmth shooting up his arm and straight to his chest. Daniel felt 30 years of carefully constructed walls trembling. "You barely know me." "I know enough." Her thumb traced across his knuckles, and Daniel felt 30 years of carefully constructed walls trembling. "I know you're not as heartless as you pretend to be. I know you're capable of love, even if you're afraid of it. I know you're going to need someone to remind you of that when your father is gone." "And you think that someone should be you?" Amelia's hand stilled on his, and for a moment Daniel thought he'd pushed too far, assumed too much. But then she smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I think," she said carefully, "that your father gave me this ring for a reason. Not just because he wanted me to remember his story, but because he wanted me to understand that some love is worth diving to the bottom of the ocean for." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. "Amelia!" "I'm not asking you to dive to the bottom of the ocean," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "I'm just asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, some risks are worth taking." The door opened suddenly, and a night nurse entered with medication. The spell was broken, and Amelia withdrew her hand, but the warmth lingered. Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind reeling with the implications of what had just passed between them. As the nurse checked Thomas's vitals and adjusted his IV, Daniel found himself studying Amelia's face, memorizing the curve of her lips, the way her dreadlocks fell across her shoulder, the quiet confidence in her posture. For the first time in his adult life, he was considering the possibility that his father might be right, that some people were built to run toward love, not away from it. And as terrifying as that thought was, Daniel realized he was beginning to hope that Amelia might be willing to teach him the difference. 3 days later, Daniel's carefully ordered world began to unravel at 3:47 a.m. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him from restless sleep. The caller ID showed Manhattan Presbyterian, and Daniel's blood turned to ice. He'd been expecting this call, dreading it, but somehow still wasn't prepared for the gentle voice of the night nurse. "Mr. Whitmore, you asked us to call if there were any changes. Your father's condition has deteriorated significantly. You should come now." Daniel was dressed and out the door within minutes, his heart hammering as he navigated the empty Manhattan streets. The city looked different at this hour, softer, more vulnerable, stripped of its daytime pretensions. He thought about the last conversation he'd had with his father, how Thomas had squeezed his hand and said, "Don't wait too long to be happy, son. Life's shorter than you think." The hospital corridors were dimly lit, filled with the hushed sounds of night shift nurses and the soft beeping of monitors. Daniel's footsteps echoed as he hurried toward room 1247, each step feeling like a countdown to the moment that would change everything. He found Amelia already there, sitting beside his father's bed, holding Thomas's hand. She was wearing scrubs again. She'd been pulling extra shifts, Daniel had learned, wanting to be there as much as possible during these final days. Her dreadlocks were pulled back, and even in the dim light, he could see the exhaustion in her face. "How long has he been like this?" Daniel asked quietly, taking his place on the other side of the bed. "About an hour. He was asking for you." Amelia's voice was thick with emotion. "He's been drifting in and out of consciousness, but he's still fighting. Still here." Daniel looked at his father, really looked at him. Thomas's breathing was labored, his skin pale and waxy, but there was still that familiar strength in his features. The jewelry box sat empty on the bedside table, a reminder of the gift that had changed everything. "Dad," Daniel said softly, taking Thomas's other hand. "I'm here." Thomas's eyes fluttered open, and despite the morphine, despite the pain, they focused on Daniel with perfect clarity. "Danny." The word was barely a whisper, but it carried 3 decades of love and pride. "I'm here, Dad. I'm not going anywhere." Thomas's gaze shifted to Amelia, and his lips curved in the faintest smile. "Both of you. Good. Need to tell you something. About the pearl." Daniel felt Amelia's hand tighten around Thomas's and saw her lean forward slightly. "What about it, Mr. Whitmore?" Not just about the dive." Thomas's breathing was becoming more labored, but his voice grew stronger with urgency. "About what happened after, when I gave it to Margaret."
Daniel found himself holding his breath, sensing that whatever his father was about to say would be important. "She cried," Thomas continued, his eyes distant with memory, "but not just because of the pearl. She cried because she said she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to love her enough to risk everything. Someone who would dive to the bottom of the ocean for her." He paused, his eyes moving between Daniel and Amelia. "That's what love is, you see. Not the pretty gestures or the expensive gifts. It's the willingness to risk everything, your pride, your safety, your heart, for someone else's happiness." Daniel felt his throat tighten. "Dad?" "I gave Amelia that ring," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength one last time, "because I saw something in her eyes when she looked at you. The same thing I saw in Margaret's eyes when she looked at me. Recognition. The kind of love that makes you willing to dive." The room fell silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Daniel stared at his father, then at Amelia, whose cheeks were wet with tears. The pearl ring on her finger caught the light, and Daniel remembered his father's words. "Some people are built to run toward love, not away from it." "And Danny?" Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "I saw the same thing in your eyes when you looked at her. You're just too scared to admit it." Daniel felt every wall he'd built over 30 years crumbling at once. "Dad?" "Don't wait," Thomas whispered urgently. "Don't spend years building walls when you could be building something beautiful. Don't let fear rob you of the best parts of life." Thomas's breathing became more shallow, and Daniel felt panic rising in his chest. "Dad, don't go. Not yet. I need more time." "You have all the time you need," Thomas said, his voice fading. "You just have to choose to use it." His eyes closed, and the room fell quiet, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Daniel watched his father's chest rise and fall, each breath a gift they both knew was temporary. "I love you, Dad," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I love you so much." Thomas's eyes opened one last time, and he smiled. "I know, and I love you too, both of you." His gaze shifted to Amelia. "Take care of each other. Promise me." "We promise," Amelia said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Good. That's all I needed to hear." What would you want to say to someone you love if you knew it might be your last chance? Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're facing our deepest fears. Share your thoughts below. The next hour passed in a blur of quiet conversations, gentle touches, and the kind of profound intimacy that only comes in the presence of approaching death. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, but whenever he was awake, he seemed at peace. He told fragments of stories about Margaret, about Daniel's childhood, about the early days of building the company, but mostly he just held their hands and smiled. At 6:23 a.m., as the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of the hospital, Thomas Whitmore took his last breath. It was peaceful, surrounded by love, exactly as he would have wanted it. Daniel sat frozen for a long moment, staring at his father's still face. 38 years of shared history, of love and conflict and reconciliation, had come to this quiet moment. The most important person in his life was gone, and Daniel felt simultaneously empty and full. Empty of the future they'd planned, full of the love they'd shared. "She's at peace," Amelia said softly, her hand still holding Thomas's. "He's with your mother now." Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. He stood on shaking legs and walked to the window, staring out at the city that was beginning to wake up. Somewhere out there, people were starting their days, drinking coffee, checking emails, living their lives as if the world hadn't just fundamentally changed. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice barely audible. "Do what?" Amelia asked gently. "Live without him. Be alone again." Daniel heard her footsteps behind him, felt her presence like warmth against his back. "You don't have to be alone." He turned to face her, and what he saw in her eyes made his breath catch. It was the same look his father had described: recognition, understanding, the kind of love that made people willing to risk everything. "Daniel," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know how to do this either." "What?" "Love someone, trust someone, risk everything for someone else's happiness." He paused, his heart hammering. "I've spent 30 years building walls, and I don't know how to tear them down." Amelia stepped closer, and Daniel could see the pearl ring on her finger, could smell that faint lavender scent that had become associated with comfort and peace. "You don't have to tear them down all at once. You just have to be willing to let someone in." "What if I hurt you? What if I'm not capable of the kind of love my father had? What if you are?" Amelia's voice was steady, confident. "What if you're exactly as capable of love as you are of fear? What if the only difference is choice?" Daniel felt tears on his cheeks, the first tears he had shed in 15 years. "I'm scared." "I know." Amelia reached up and touched his face, her thumb wiping away the moisture. "But your father was right. Some risks are worth taking." Daniel looked into her eyes and saw his future, not the lonely, controlled existence he'd planned, but something messier and more beautiful. He saw lazy Sunday mornings and difficult conversations, laughter and tears, the kind of partnership that made people stronger together than they were apart. "He gave you that ring for a reason," Daniel said, his voice steadying. "He did. Not just because he wanted you to remember his story. No," Amelia's voice was soft but certain. "Because he wanted me to understand that some love is worth diving for." Daniel felt something shift inside him, not just the walls coming down, but something new being built in their place. "I don't know how to dive to the bottom of the ocean." "That's okay," Amelia said, her smile breaking through her tears. "I'm not asking you to dive to the bottom of the ocean. I'm just asking you to take the first step." "What would the first step be?" he asked. "Admitting that you're already in love with me." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of truth and possibility. Daniel felt his heart stop, then start again, with a rhythm that seemed to match hers. "I am," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "I'm in love with you. I think I have been since the moment I saw you hold that ring like it was the most precious thing in the world."
Amelia's smile was radiant. "I'm in love with you too. I think I have been since the moment I saw you cry at your father's bedside, even though you were trying so hard not to." Daniel reached for her then, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that surprised them both. She felt perfect against him, solid and warm and real. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling that lavender scent
that had become synonymous with home. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered against her ear. "You won't," she whispered back. "I'm not going anywhere." "How can you be sure?" "Because I'm not built to run away from love. I'm built to run toward it." Daniel pulled back to look at her face, and what he saw there made his heart soar. It was the same expression his father had described seeing in his mother's eyes: recognition, acceptance, the kind of love that made people willing to risk everything. "Your father was right," Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder. "Some people are built to run toward love." "And some people," Amelia said, reaching up to touch his face, "are worth learning to run toward." Daniel kissed her then, soft and gentle and full of promise. It was nothing like the calculated encounters he'd had before. This was honest and vulnerable and terrifying and perfect. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers and felt for the first time in his life completely at peace. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we figure it out together. We grieve your father, we celebrate his life, and we start building something beautiful." Daniel looked over at the bed where Thomas lay peaceful and still, and he could swear he saw the faintest smile on his father's face. The jewelry box sat empty beside him, but Daniel understood now that it wasn't empty at all. It was full of love that had been passed on, full of stories that would continue to be told, full of the promise that some things were worth risking everything for. "Together," Daniel repeated, testing the word on his tongue. It felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like coming home to a place he'd never been. "Together," Amelia confirmed, her hand finding his and squeezing tight. And as the sun rose over Manhattan, painting the hospital room in shades of gold and promise, Daniel Whitmore finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him all along, that love wasn't a weakness to be avoided, but a strength to be embraced, that some people were worth diving to the bottom of the ocean for, that some risks were worth taking. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the garden of his Hamptons estate, watching Amelia tend to the flower bed she'd planted in Thomas's memory. The late April sun caught the highlights in her dreadlocks, and she hummed softly as she worked, completely absorbed in coaxing life from the dark soil. The pearl ring still lived on her right hand, but now it was accompanied by a simple engagement ring on her left, a vintage emerald that had belonged to his grandmother. Daniel had proposed on Christmas Eve, 3 months after his father's death, in the hospital room where they'd first fallen in love. It had felt right to begin their future in the place where his father had taught him to stop running from love. "The daisies are coming in beautifully," Amelia said, looking up at him with soil-stained hands and a radiant smile. "Your father would have loved seeing this." Daniel knelt beside her, breathing in the scent of earth and growing things. 6 months ago, he would have hired a team of landscapers to maintain his property. Now he found peace in the simple act of planting seeds and watching them grow, a metaphor that wasn't lost on him. "He would have loved seeing us," Daniel replied, brushing a streak of dirt from her cheek. "I think he knew before we did." He was a wise man. Amelia leaned into his touch, and Daniel marveled at how natural it felt, this easy intimacy, this comfortable silence between them. "I miss him." "So do I." Daniel's voice was steady now when he spoke about his father. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like a wound. Instead, it felt like love with nowhere to go, so he'd learned to channel it into building the life Thomas had wanted for him. The sound of car doors slamming in the driveway interrupted their quiet moment. Daniel checked his watch. Right on time. "They're here." Amelia's face lit up with excitement. "I can't wait to meet them." Daniel stood and helped her to her feet, brushing soil from her gardening clothes. Today was important. Amelia's grandmother was visiting from Atlanta, along with her aunt and 2 cousins. It would be the first time Daniel met the family that had raised the woman he loved, and he was more nervous than he had been for any presentation. "What if they don't like me?" he asked, voicing the fear that had been nagging him all week. Amelia laughed, the sound like music in the garden air. "They're going to love you. How could they not?" "I'm not exactly what most families picture when they think of their daughter's ideal partner."
And what's that supposed to mean? Daniel hesitated, then decided on honesty. Rich white guy with trust issues who used to hate women? I'm not exactly a catch. Amelia turned to face him fully, her expression serious. Daniel Whitmore, do you know what my grandmother said when I told her about you? I'm afraid to ask. She said, baby girl, I don't care if he's purple with green polka dots. If he loves you the way you deserve to be loved, and if he makes you smile the way you've been smiling in every phone call, then he's family. Amelia's voice softened. And when I told her about the pearl ring, about what your father did, she cried for 20 minutes. She said she'd been praying for years for someone to love me that deeply. Daniel felt his throat tighten. And do I love you that deeply? You dove to the bottom of your own ocean for me, Amelia said, touching his face. You risked everything you thought you knew about yourself, everything you thought you needed to protect yourself from. That's deeper than any dive for a pearl. The front door opened and voices drifted toward them, warm, animated conversation that made Daniel's chest tighten with something he'd rarely experienced, the anticipation of belonging somewhere. Come on, Amelia said, taking his hand. Time to meet the people who made me who I am. Daniel squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her confidence. 6 months ago, he would have approached this meeting like a business negotiation, armed with talking points and strategies. Now, he simply wanted to be worthy of the love these people had given the woman he cherished. They walked toward the house together, and Daniel marveled at how much his life had changed. The estate that once felt like a fortress now felt like a home. The silence that had once been his refuge now felt empty, without Amelia's laughter filling it. The isolation that had once been his protection now seemed like the prison it had always been.
Amelia, honey, a voice called out as they approached the patio. Where's this man we've been hearing so much about? Daniel saw her first, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that were unmistakably related to Amelia's. She moved with the same grace, the same quiet strength, and when she smiled, Daniel understood where Amelia had learned to light up a room. Grandma Ruby, Amelia said, rushing forward for a hug. This is Daniel. Ruby stepped back from her granddaughter and studied Daniel with the kind of intensity that made him feel like he was being assessed not just as a person, but as a potential guardian of something precious. Her gaze lingered on his face, taking in everything, his nervousness, his hope, his obvious love for Amelia. So you're the man who's got my granddaughter glowing like a firefly, Ruby said, her voice carrying a hint of southern accent. Yes, ma'am, Daniel replied, extending his hand. It's an honor to meet you. Ruby ignored his handshake and pulled him into a hug that smelled like lavender and home cooking. None of that handshaking nonsense. You're family now. Have you ever experienced a moment when you felt truly welcomed into a family, whether biological or chosen? What made that moment special? Share your story below. The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions, stories, and the kind of easy conversation that Daniel had never experienced with his own family. Ruby regaled them with tales of Amelia's childhood, her aunt shared embarrassing teenage stories, and her cousins treated Daniel like they'd known him for years. But it was during dinner, as they sat around the table Daniel had bought for entertaining clients but never used, that he truly understood what he'd been missing all his life. Tell us about the pearl ring, Ruby said, her eyes twinkling. Amelia told us the story, but I want to hear it from you. Daniel looked at Amelia, who nodded encouragingly. He took a breath and began to tell the story of his father's final days, of the gift that had changed everything, of the love that had transformed his understanding of what it meant to be human. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man, Ruby said when he finished. A man who understood that love isn't about what we can give someone, but about what we're willing to risk for them. He was, Daniel agreed. I just wish I'd understood that while he was alive. Oh, honey, Ruby said, reaching across the table to pat his hand. You think he didn't know? You think he didn't see the change in you? That man knew exactly what he was doing when he gave my granddaughter that ring. Daniel felt his eyes mist. What do you mean? He was making sure you both understood that love isn't just about the moment you find it.
It's about what you build with it afterward. Ruby's voice carried the wisdom of someone who had loved and loved again. That ring isn't just a symbol of his love for your mother. It's a symbol of his faith in your future together. After dinner, as the family settled in the living room with coffee and Ruby's famous peach cobbler, Daniel found himself on the patio with Amelia, looking out at the garden they'd planted together. "Your grandmother is incredible," he said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "She likes you," Amelia replied. "I can tell. She's been watching you all evening, and she has that look she gets when she's decided someone is worth keeping." "And what look is that?" "The look she had when she first met my grandfather. The same look she had when she decided to take me in after my parents died. The look that says, this one's going to be family." Daniel felt something settle in his chest, a peace he'd never experienced before. "I never thought I'd have this." "Have what?" "A family. Real connection. People who love me not because of what I can do for them, but because of who I am." He paused, looking into her eyes. "I never thought I'd feel like I belonged somewhere. And now? Now I know that home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to love you, even when you're difficult to love." Amelia smiled, and Daniel was struck again by how beautiful she was. Not just physically, but in the way she moved through the world with such grace and compassion. "You're not difficult to love, Daniel. You're just out of practice being loved." "I'm learning." "We both are." Daniel kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers and felt the weight of his father's wisdom settling over him like a blessing. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Amelia raised an eyebrow. "We're not exchanging more jewelry, are we? I can only wear so many meaningful rings." Daniel laughed. "Not jewelry. Something else." He handed her a small velvet box, and she opened it to reveal a key, old-fashioned and ornate, clearly antique. "What's this?" she asked, looking puzzled. "The key to the house in Tuscany," Daniel said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I bought it last month. It's where I want us to go for our honeymoon, but more than that, it's where I want us to build our life together." Amelia's eyes widened. "Daniel, I can't." "Yes, you can." Daniel took his hands, key and all. "I've spent 38 years building walls and accumulating things that don't matter. I want to spend the rest of my life building something that does matter. With you." "Are you sure? It's a big change. Living in Italy." "I'm sure." Daniel's voice carried absolute certainty. "I've already started moving the company operations so I can work remotely. The house has gardens, Amelia, acres of them, and a vineyard, and a view of the countryside that will take your breath away." Amelia looked down at the key, then back at his face. "What about your life here? Your business? Your routine?" "My life is wherever you are. Everything else is just logistics." "And aren't you scared? Of changing everything? Of taking such a big risk?" Daniel smiled, remembering his father's words. "I'm terrified. But I'm more scared of not taking the risk. I'm more scared of playing it safe and missing out on the adventure of building a life with you." Amelia's smile was radiant. "A vineyard, you said?" "A vineyard. We can make wine, host weddings, maybe start a family if you want." Daniel's voice grew softer. "I know it's a lot to ask." "It's not asking," Amelia interrupted. "It's offering. You're offering to build something beautiful with me. And, Daniel," she reached up to touch his face, "I can't think of anything I want more." "Really?" "Really." She kissed him, and Daniel felt his heart soar. "Besides, your father would have loved it. A vineyard in Italy. He would have said it was the perfect place for someone who learned to dive for pearls." Daniel laughed, pulling her closer. "He would have, wouldn't he?"
"He would have been so proud of you," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Look how far you've come. 6 months ago, you were afraid to let anyone close. Now you're planning to move to Italy and start a vineyard. 6 months ago, I thought love was weakness. Now, I know it's the only thing that makes us strong." From inside the house, they could hear the sounds of Ruby telling stories, of family laughter, of the kind of warmth that Daniel had spent his entire life thinking was impossible. He looked at Amelia,
at the pearl ring on her finger, at the engagement ring that promised their future, and felt a gratitude so profound it took his breath away. "Your father was right," Amelia said, as if reading his thoughts. "Some people are built to run toward love." "And some people," Daniel replied, echoing her words from that night in the hospital, "are worth learning to run toward." As if summoned by their conversation, Ruby appeared in the doorway. "You two lovebirds coming back inside? I've got more stories to tell, and this old woman needs an audience." Daniel and Amelia exchanged a look, then burst into laughter. "We're coming, Grandma Ruby," Amelia called. As they walked back toward the house, Daniel felt the weight of his father's blessing, the warmth of newfound family, and the promise of a future built on love instead of fear. The pearl ring on Amelia's finger caught the porch light, and he remembered Thomas's words about diving to the bottom of the ocean for someone you loved. He'd done his own kind of diving, not into water, but into the depths of his own heart, into the terrifying possibility of vulnerability and connection. And what he'd found there wasn't a pearl, but something far more precious, the courage to love and be loved in return. "Ready for the next chapter?" Amelia asked, squeezing his hand. Daniel looked at the woman who had taught him that love wasn't a weakness, but a strength, at the house that had become a home, at the family that had welcomed him with open arms. He thought about the vineyard in Tuscany, about the life they would build together, about the children they might have who would grow up understanding that love was something to run toward, not away from. "Ready?" he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. And as they stepped into the warm light of the house, surrounded by the sounds of love and laughter, Daniel Whitmore finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him all along, that the greatest treasures in life weren't found at the bottom of the ocean, but in the courage to open your heart to another human being. Some risks, he realized, were always worth taking.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.